Hi folks, this is Pastor Sarah with a kids' church message for upper elementary kids for the month of October. Our story this month is the story of Noah's Ark. I bet you have already heard this story, right? If for some reason you are not familiar with this story, I would encourage you to watch our video for the lower elementary school for this month. Aiden, one of our high school students, tells the story, and he did a fantastic job. So if you just need a refresher on the story of Noah and Noah's Ark, you can watch that video. But I am guessing that most of you who are in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade already know the story. And so today I want to talk a little bit about how we make sense of a story like this. Because you are probably old enough that you listen to this story and you immediately have a lot of questions. Like, how exactly could all of those animals fit into a boat? Or how could one person collect all of the animal species from around the whole planet to protect them? Or how could the whole planet be flooded anyway? This is a story that raises a lot of questions about, like, could this have actually happened in history? And the truth is that it probably didn't happen, not the way that the story is told in the Bible. There were many situations in ancient history where there were big floods, and whole nations or whole communities might have been very badly impacted by these big floods. So it's likely that this story came out of that kind of experience. You can imagine in the ancient world when there weren't cars or planes or motors, if there was a big flood, even if it only impacted a place the size of, say, the greater Kalamazoo area, it could feel like your whole world because there wasn't a quick way to get anywhere else. So, what can we learn from this story? We've talked a little bit already about how sometimes there are stories in the Bible that aren't telling us what happened scientifically, or in this case, what happened historically. They're stories that we would call myths, stories that tell us something about human beings and something about God. And the story of Noah's Ark is one of those stories. So I wonder what things you think the story of Noah's Ark teaches us. Maybe it teaches us that human beings are supposed to take care of non-human beings. Maybe it's a story that tells us that even when it seems like the whole world is falling apart, God is always working to bring new possibilities on the other side of the storm. I think there are a lot of true things that we could learn from this story. And I want to start introducing you all to the idea that things in the Bible aren't perfect. Did you know that already? Have you read enough stories in the Bible that you've started to notice that sometimes the people in the Bible, even the ones that we think of as heroes like Noah, they aren't perfect people? So today's story is a different kind of story about Noah's Ark. It's called Mrs. Noah's Pockets. You ready to hear it? Mrs. Noah's Pockets. A story by Jackie Morris with pictures by James Mayhew. It rained. Not the kind of rain that comes in a shower, then passes. This rain came from a sky dark as a bruise, falling hard and fast, beating the earth, washing down tracks, making streams of pathways and rivers of roads. Mr. Noah stood on a hill, saw the water rising, began to build an ark. This, he said, will be the ideal time to tidy up the world a bit. The ideal time to get rid of some of those more troublesome creatures. By day, Mr. Noah would draw out plans, hammer and saw at wood, steadily building the biggest boat the world had ever seen. By night, he sat in a corner and made lists. One for all the animals who would sail with the ark, 2 of every kind, and one for the troublesome creatures that Mr. Noah wished to leave behind. All the time, Mrs. Noah watched Mr. Noah. She saw the plans. She watched as he worked. She saw the lists. She smiled. She took out her sewing machine and began to stitch. She snipped and she threaded and she tacked and she tucked and she stitched. How lovely, thought Mr. Noah. Mrs. Noah is making curtains for the windows of my ark. Mrs. Noah just smiled. When the ark was finished, Mr. Noah gathered 2 animals from all around the world, 2 by 2, and took them into the shelter, out of the rain. Mrs. Noah went for one last walk, wading through water into the heart of the Mythico wood, on errands of her own. At last, all were gathered inside the ark. It heaved with animals, large and small. Mr. Noah had been too busy and important to notice there were no curtains at the window. Mrs. Noah wore a brand new coat, stitched and snipped and tucked and turned, with a hood and a cape, and very deep pockets. Lots of pockets. And still it rained. The hollows of the land began to fill. Lakes formed in valleys. The water rose higher and higher until it tickled the base of the boat, where it rested on the hill. The water lifted it. They began to float. Mr. Noah cut the ropes that held the ark at anchor, and away they drifted. The rain beat on the roof. Great rods of battering rain. All the animals and Mr. Noah and the children sheltered in the dry of the ark. Mrs. Noah stood on the prow, wearing her hood up, umbrella in hand, watching the dolphins and mermaids racing the waves. Every evening, after all the animals had been cared for and when the owls began their evening song, Mr. Noah would fall asleep. Mrs. Noah would gather the children around and tell them tales of dragons and unicorns, griffin and phoenix, centaurs and jackalopes, wolpertingers, and all manner of things. Now and again, Mr. Noah would wake and mutter, "Bah, unicorns, troublesome creatures." The children sometimes thought they could see things moving deep in Mrs. Noah's pockets. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Then one morning, everyone awoke to silence. The rain had stopped. The clouds began to roll away. The sky was a most beautiful cornflower blue. Everyone waited. Everyone watched as Mr. Noah sent out a raven to search for land. Later that day, the raven came back. No land anywhere. It seemed that the world had drowned in all the rain. The ark sailed on. Mr. Noah sent out a dove. High, high in the clear blue sky, they all watched until she disappeared. Much later that day, as the sun colored the sea to glow with gold, over the water she came. In her beak was a small twig of green olive. The next day, they followed the dove until the ark came to rest on the tip of a mountain. All the animals spilled out onto the land as Mr. Noah watched and smiled. So much tidier without those troublesome ones. Mrs. Noah, her coattails flapping in the warm wind, wandered away from the ark into a wood that grew close by. Here, one at a time, she emptied her pockets, being careful to lift the creatures all out, setting them free, 2 by 2, into the new land. What creatures did you see on those last 2 pages? This story is told a little differently than the story in our Bible, isn't it? Nothing in the way the story is told in our Bible suggests that Mr. Noah was actually trying to tidy up the world and get rid of troublesome creatures. But the way the story is told in the Bible, there are people who are troublesome. And that's part of why God sends the rain and the floods. I wonder if those kinds of disasters come to make the world a better place. Or I wonder whether these stories can show us the way that we can be working to take care of the world and creatures in it so that there are possibilities even when bad times come. Sometimes people want to look for reasons. If there's a hurricane or an earthquake or something horrible happens, people want to know that there was a reason. And sometimes people say that God is that reason. That people did such horrible things that God is bringing punishment. But I'll tell you the truth, I don't believe that that's the way God is. I believe that God is a lot more like Mrs. Noah in this book. And in some ways like Mr. Noah, the main character Noah in the Bible story, focused on preserving life in whatever ways that they can, using the tools and the skills that they have to protect who they can when bad times come. That's where I see God. And what's exciting to me is that all of us can do that. I wonder how you can do that. Are there ways that you can use your skills and your tools to protect other people when times are hard? In November, we are going to be collecting coats and maybe boots too, but especially coats, because we want to provide for people who might not have houses this winter. And we want to help them to stay warm and safe even when the weather gets colder. So I hope that you'll look around your house, and if you have a coat that you've grown out of, but that still is in good shape, it doesn't have holes or anything, maybe your family can donate that coat to our coat drive. There are lots of ways that we can use our tools and the things that we have around us to protect other people when times are hard. And that's something our church does really, really well. And it's something that you guys are a part of, no matter how young you are. You are a part of the ministries of our church, and I'm grateful for you. Have a good month.